Hi there, and welcome to another edition of the 1% Better podcast with your host, Rob O'Donoghue.
Hello there. Welcome to another episode of the 1% Better podcast, and I'm releasing this again around Christmas, probably the third or maybe fourth I release around this time of the year. Bit more time on my hands, so really wanted to do a podcast talking about books that I read in 2018. So let me just be clear, the majority of these have been released before 2018. I've just got round to reading them this year, probably through recommendations from the podcast guests or through friends or just some that have been gifted or lent to me, and decided to narrow it down. 10 mightn't seem that narrow, but these were 10 that have had an impact on me that I really enjoyed, that have helped me improve in some areas, given me ideas to focus on to make some improvements in my life in different areas, and thought it might be of value to you to share them and see if you get something out of it as well. All 10 are on my books page on the website, so if you were interested you could click on that and purchase it through Amazon there, or just get them in your local bookstore. And they're not in any particular order other than I think close to the order I read them in. They're definitely all worth checking out, and I hope you enjoy it. First time doing this type of podcast, as I said. Let me know how it goes, and feedback, ideas, suggestions for books for 2019, very welcome as well. I have a list already, but that list is always growing, and if there's one or two you think that should be very high up on it, let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Enjoy this 10 book review podcast, and have a great rest of day, week, and Happy New Year if it's around that time. Good luck and enjoy. Okay, so number one, book one that I'm putting out is probably no surprise to anyone that's listened to the podcast this year, or any of the little clips I've done, or even wrote some articles that touched on this. It is a book by Susan Cain, and it's called Quiet: The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking. I read this one at the start of the year, and it had a massive impact on me, and it's one I've kind of looked back on now and again during the year, and will continue to do so. It's been great. I've actually been able to connect with Susan over Twitter or LinkedIn, and at some point it'd be amazing to have her on the podcast. But what I loved about the book, and continue to like about it, is that it's full of stories from her own experience and from the interviews she's done putting it together, but it's backed up by a lot of scientific data that goes into the details around what it is to be an introvert, and also talks about extroversion, and even mentions the somewhere in between the ambivert towards the end, I seem to recall, because I think it's a word that became clear to me as I did a bit more research into the whole area. Yeah, it's definitely one I wanted to start the recommendations with. For folks that have got it over the course of the year that I talked with, that have come back to me, they were in a similar vein, very impressed. If there were introverts themselves, they could totally relate to a lot of the content. Susan certainly goes into details around presentations as well, which can scare the hell out of a lot of people. Certainly the case for introverts, and it's the one I wanted to start with. So I said I'd try and maybe pick out a little passage and read that, see how that goes with this. So, introverts' disinclination to change ahead is not only a hedge against risk, it also pays off on intellectual tasks. Here are some of the things we know about the relative performance of introverts and extroverts at complex problem solving. Extroverts get better grades than introverts during elementary school, but introverts outperform extroverts in high school and college. At the university level, introversion predicts academic performance better than cognitive ability. One study tested 141 college students' knowledge of 20 different subjects, from art to astronomy to statistics, and found that introverts knew more than extroverts about every single one of them. Introverts receive disproportionate number of graduate degrees, National Merit Scholarship finalist positions, obviously that's in the US, and Pi Beta Kappa keys. Don't know what that is, but probably something important. They outperform extroverts on the Watson-Glaser critical thinking appraisal test, an assessment of critical thinking widely used by businesses for hiring and promotion. They've shown to excel at something psychologists call insightful problem solving. And the question is, why? Introverts are not smarter than extroverts. According to IQ scores, the two types are equally intelligent, and on many kinds of tasks, particularly those performed under time or social pressure or involving multitasking, extroverts do better. Extroverts are better than introverts at handling information overload. Introverts' reflectiveness uses a lot of cognitive capacity, according to Joseph Newman. On any given task, he says, if we have 100% cognitive capacity, an introvert may have only 75% on task and 25% off task, whereas an extrovert may have 90% on task. This is because most tasks are goal-directed. Extroverts appear to allocate most of their cognitive capacity to the goal at hand, while introverts use up capacity by monitoring how the task is going. So look, that's just a little snippet of one of the chapters talking a bit about extroverts, introverts. It is highly recommended. I can't say too much more about it. Hopefully you check that one out. And that's book number 1. Okay, book number 2. So here's just a little piece, a page actually, from book number 2. It's entitled What I Know. And here it is. There's a secret that real writers know that wannabe writers don't. And the secret is this. It's not the writing part that's hard. What's hard is sitting down to write. What keeps us from sitting down is resistance. So that's a little piece from a book called The War of Art, Break Through the Blocks and Win Your Inner Creative Battles. It's written by a guy called Stephen Pressfield, and I got this at the start of last year as well. One of the goals I had for this year was to do a lot more writing. It's something that scares me a little, something I wouldn't consider myself to be great at. As a result, that's probably one of the reasons why I didn't do so much of it. That's where the resistance piece came in. I was listening to a podcast around this time last year, and they were talking about creative endeavours, not just writing, it could be anything. And this was recommended as a small little handbook that you could use, dip in and out of, and hopefully get some inspiration from and help you break through some of those blocks, some of those resistance. And he does talk about the different types of resistance. There is so many reasons not to sit down and write, or not to do that 5K, or paint that image that's in your mind, or whatever it is. So I thought this would be useful for me as I tried to write more this year. And it certainly was. I did a lot of writing every day. Earlier in the year, I had a monthly goal to write for 45 minutes every day, and did a lot of that. And some of the stuff might never come out, might just be for myself, but it certainly helped me get into more of a rhythm. I'm by no means an expert now at all, but this book certainly helped me overcome that resistance. One other piece that always sticks out from reading it, I can't find the page right now, but it was, sitting down to write. You might feel like you have written for 45 minutes and it's rubbish, but that's almost essential. That's necessary to get to the good stuff. So if you're writing something, it's better sometimes just coming out and getting the bad pieces of text out that make no sense. Once you do that, maybe shortly afterwards, the real insightful stuff comes. So I would highly recommend that one, Stephen Pressfield. He has a number of other books, as I might have just mentioned at the start, but this one, The War of Art, certainly helped me this year, and continues to help me when I put out something I'd like to do, like even this podcast. It's around books for the year, resisting doing it a little bit, but now I'm actually doing it, and this sort of book has been helpful to push me forward. So there you go, number 2, The War of Art. Okay, so number 3, and there is a this isn't on purpose, but there seems to be a lot of books out there that are the art of, or the war of, or art is mentioned a few times, probably one or two more to come. But this one is called The Art of Living, the Classical Manual on Virtue, Happiness and Effectiveness. And it's a new interpretation of Epictetus's writings from a couple of millennium ago, I suppose, or millennia ago. And it's written by a lady called Sharon Lebell. This was gifted to me, or lent to me maybe is a better word. Niall, I promise I will give it back, but as of now I still have it in my hands. And it's a bit like the last one in a way that it is a short book. It's each page has a couple of paragraphs on it with a point to make, or a bit of wisdom to share. And it is certainly one that you can pick up and dip in and dip out of. I think I read it back to back very quickly, but since have maybe tried to read a page a day every now and again just to take something out of it. So if you're familiar with Epictetus or Marcus Aurelius and this movement around Stoicism, I think Tim Ferriss talks a lot about it, Stoic philosophy, this is kind of new interpretations of that. So let me just read a little bit from the foreword. Epictetus believed that the primary job of philosophy is to help ordinary people effectively meet the everyday challenges of daily life and to deal with life's inevitable major losses, disappointments and griefs. His was a moral teaching stripped of sentimentality, piousness and metaphysical mumbo-jumbo. What remains is the West's finest and best primer for living the best possible life. While many readers have turned to Eastern sources for non-sectarian spiritual guidance, the West has had a vital, if overlooked, classic treasury of such helpful action wisdom all along. I suppose his teachings, his scriptures, or whatever you want to call his philosophies, came out around the same time as Buddhism, and they obviously wouldn't have known about each other that much at the time. Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching as well. There's been comparisons to these, and The Art of Living is pretty much a philosophy of the same ilk, but more of a Western view. So that's kind of a little bit about it. Let me just jump to one page here that stood out for me when I was flicking back through it. So it's titled, Events Don't Hurt Us, but Our Views of Them Can. Things themselves don't hurt us or hinder us, nor do other people. How we view these things is another matter. It is our attitudes and reactions that give us trouble. Therefore, even death is no big deal in and of itself. It is our notion of death, our idea that it is terrible, that terrifies us. There are so many different ways to think about death. Scrutinize your notions about death and everything else. Are they really true? Are they doing you any good? Don't dread death or pain. Dread the fear of death or pain. We cannot choose our external circumstances, but we can always choose how we respond to them. And I think I read that one myself at a time when I was, something had happened, and you probably jump into modes of blaming other people or events happening. Ultimately, it's how you control your own feelings, how you react to that. Mindfulness meditation can be tied into a lot of this ability to be non-reactive and non-grasping, and that's what struck a chord for me when I read that. So that's just one of those pages. There's about 120 or 30. There's so many really cool ones. I just flicked past one called The Power of Habit there, which I totally believe in, the power of doing things on a daily basis to get a little bit better. But yeah, that's The Art of Living. Hopefully that gives you a little taster. It's a small book, but lots of value in it. Okay, so up to book number 4. It was a number 1 New York Times bestseller. It is called Switch, How to Change Things When Change is Hard. And it is by Chip Heath and Dan Heath, also known as the Heath brothers. And it's all, as it says, it's all about change. It can be changing yourself, changing your team, changing your organization. And as many people will know, this is not easy. Probably changing yourself can be very, very difficult. Never mind changing the direction of a group, of a team, of an organisation. And these guys definitely have done an awful lot of research from a psychological perspective, and it comes out in the book. It's a very, very cool and interesting read with lots of useful information that you can take on board, and you can put some plans in place to talk about change. They reference change from everybody's made up of an emotional side and a rational side, and to get to where you want to go to, you kind of have to manage both of those independently and interdependently. You've got to connect with both. That is obviously the hard part. They talk about the rational side, they call it the rider, and an emotional side is the elephant. So the rider is on the elephant, and you have to manage the two together. And they really do go into detail on how you do that. They talk about directing the rider, motivating the elephant, and then shaping the path. When I read this at the time, I think I was writing an article about a goal setting, and you might be familiar with SMART goals, which are specific, actionable, measurable, realistic, time-bound, I think is the acronym. They work without doubt, but in many cases, they don't really talk about the emotional part of the goal and really tapping into that motivating factor of what will get you to where you want to go to. And that's the motivating the elephant part that these guys talk about, tapping into the emotions. Let me just read one little piece of it around big change. So here's an example from the book. Big change can happen. Don Berwick and his team catalyzed a change that saved 100,000 lives, yet Berwick himself wielded no power. He couldn't change the law. He couldn't fire hospital leaders who didn't agree with him. He couldn't pay bonuses to hospitals that didn't accept his proposals. Berwick had the same tools the rest of us have. First, he dictated his audience's rider. The destination was crystal clear. Some is not a number. Soon is not a time. Here's the number, 100,000. Here's the time, June 14th, 2006, 9 a.m. But that wasn't enough. He had to help hospitals figure out how to get there, and he couldn't simply say, try harder. So he proposed 6 specific interventions, such as elevating the heads of patients on ventilators that were known to save lives. By staying laser focused on these 6 interventions, Berwick made sure not to exhaust the riders of his audience with endless behavioural changes, because behavioural changes can be difficult. Second, he motivated his audience's elephants, which is the motivational, emotional part. He made them feel the need for change. Many of the people in the audience already knew the facts, but knowing was not enough. Berwick had to get beyond knowing, so he brought his audience face to face with the mother of a girl who had been killed by a medical error. Quote, I know that if this campaign had been in place 4 or 5 years ago, that Josie would be fine. End quote. Berwick was also careful to motivate the people who hadn't been in the room for his presentation. He didn't challenge people to overhaul medicine or bring TQM or total quality management to healthcare. He challenged them to save 100,000 lives. That speaks to anyone's elephant. So that's just a little bit from it. There's a third part, but maybe if you check it out, you'll enjoy it. So again, it's all about change. For me, a lot of things that I focus on is figuring out where you want to go to, or figuring out your values and your purpose. And once you have a clear view of that, then you can probably plot your plan, where you want to get to, your goal. How do you want to get there? And that's where the real change happens. That's I suppose the rider part, and the elephant is more around the purpose piece. And this book is very useful for that. But I would recommend it. It's a good one, and not only for your personal development, but within your team, within your organisation. On to number 5, book number 5. So I'm just reading a little bit of a post on Inc.com. It starts with, Steve Jobs planned every detail of his own memorial service held at Stanford University in October 2011, including the brown box each attendee received as a farewell gift. One of these attendees was Mark Bienhoff, CEO of Salesforce.com, and 2 years later at a TechCrunch Disrupt conference, he recounted his feelings at the moment when he opened the box. This is going to be good, he recalled. I knew this was a decision Steve made, and whatever it was, It was the last thing he wanted us all to think about. The box contained the book Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramhansa Yogananda. Hope I got that right. And Bienhoff continued, Yogananda had his book on self-realization. Steve's last message to us was that here is Yogananda's book, Actualize Yourself. So, when this is me talking again, so when I read that or heard about it on an interview, my interest was very much piqued around this book. I think I had heard of it before, but never really gave it that much focus. And as someone who has been developing a bit of a yoga practice over the last 12 months, doing Bikram yoga on a regular enough basis, but maybe more so meditation and mindfulness practice over the last few years, this was something I really wanted to dig into, learn more about, and hear and read what this story was all about, and what the great Steve Jobs found so fascinating, and many, many more like him over the years as well. To be honest, I absolutely enjoyed it. It is a difficult read at some points. There's a lot of, I guess, Sanskrit words in there. He is obviously coming from India, and his story can be very difficult to completely buy into. The autobiography, as it says, it's his own story, and he talks about gurus, saints, reincarnation, yogis, science, miracles, so many other fantastic things. But in a strange way, you do want to believe it. It's fact in lots of ways. There's obviously factual evidence of him being in certain places at certain times. He brought yoga effectively to the US and became very, very popular over there during his time there. And without doubt, it was like they say, it's a rare read, and one that many, many people have used and referenced to and really got familiar with over the years. And for me, it was one that I'm delighted I read this year. I think it's about 560 pages, and it can take time. It's something you will probably need to stick with. But if you're fascinated about self-actualization, understanding yourself, and learning more about the world of yoga and the kind of idea of a guru and the powers that these guys or girls may have had over time or still have, it's worth reading without a doubt. So that's why I'm putting it into the list for the year. Let me just finish by reading a piece that's in the introduction. It's from a Dr. Wedemeyer, Senator, former ambassador of India to the United States. This kind of sums Yogananda up. The experience of meeting Paramhansa Yogananda is etched in my memory as one of the unforgettable events of my life. As I looked into his face, my eyes were almost dazzled by a radiance, a light of spirituality that literally shone from him. His infinite gentleness, his gracious kindness enveloped me like warm sunshine. I could see that his understanding and insight extended to the most mundane of problems, even though he was a man of spirit. In him, I found a true ambassador of India, carrying and spreading the essence of India's ancient wisdom to the world. That's quite an intro, quite a piece that was left, and that's part of the book. He does talk during the book about his engagements and meetings with Gandhi, which is fascinating, and he goes on multiple adventures across Europe and across the US. So yeah, it's one that I would recommend. It's a good long read, and stick with it, and maybe take some notes as you go that stand out. But it makes it into the list. Alright, the next one in the list, number 6, is called The Inner Edge, and subtitled Effective Spirituality in Life and Work. And it's by Richard A. Wedemeyer and Ronald W. Zhu. I hope I pronounced those somewhat close to what it should be. So I was thinking back when I discovered this. I think it was 2017, but didn't really read it until this year. It may have been a book recommended during the coaching diploma I did, or somebody that I had talked to in and around then mentioned it was on some reading list somewhere. It's a book from 2002, and as you'll probably gather so far, many of these books are not 2018 books, but just happened to be ones I stumbled across this year. And it talks about, obviously, spirituality, the inner edge. So if you're thinking this is another deep dive within, looking inward, trying to figure yourself out, the whole concept of knowing thyself certainly is in play here. And it mentions this term called pragmatic spirituality. Let me just read a little bit of the first introduction page. The inner edge is grounded on a concept we call pragmatic spirituality. This is not connected with any religious belief or practice, but is related to the universal sense of spirituality as seeking to satisfy a hunger, or to find meaning, or to discover one's fullest potential. The objective of pragmatic spirituality, PS, is to achieve enhanced authenticity and appropriateness in everything you do, while accessing resources and capabilities beyond the limits of your rational mind, no matter what your belief system or religion may be or may not be. In developing the concept of pragmatic spirituality, we have drawn upon Eastern practices, psychology, left brain, right brain theory, and other means through which people have accessed the potential within themselves. We have also drawn from our own personal and professional experience over the years. That's obviously the authors. So if you're interested in intuition, understanding maybe a little bit more about yourself and why you're making certain decisions, this one is for you. It deep dives into the pragmatic spirituality from a personal level, but it also tries to go into a more organizational level or a workplace level and see how that would work in there. It does pose the question, what is spirituality and business, and what are the links between the two? Yeah, definitely worth checking it out. There's processes in it. There's tools that you can take on board and test out. It is, again, a deep dive, but an area of fascination for me. Anything that I can read that helps me understand why I act the way I do sometimes, or why I feel the way I do sometimes, is helpful, gives another perspective on it. There's a foreword from the Dalai Lama as well, which adds some credibility to it, I would say. And yeah, that's the inner edge, worth checking out. Book 7 is slightly different again. As I said earlier on when I talked about the book War of Art, this year I've been trying to write a little bit more, and I've always felt that my grasp of the English language, to speak it is probably okay, but to write it, I've never been fully confident that I was creating correct sentences, using commas or semicolons appropriately, or always appropriately. And yeah, if it wasn't for Grammarly or some sort of grammatical correction tool in my word processing applications, it probably would stand out a little bit more. My own typos are terrible, but that's another thing. So I picked up a book at the start of the year called The 25 Rules of Grammar, The Essential Guide to Good English. Joseph Piercy is the guy that wrote it. And again, it's one I just kind of flicked through over the course of the year and check into when I am trying to understand of a sentence that I'm looking to put together, or when to use the appropriate comma, semicolon, and specific punctuation. Why probably am I not as comfortable or confident with it? I would probably put it back to in my early years in school, not being the most attentive student. My passion for learning, I think, really only happened or started to explode from the mid-teens, and before that probably not so much focused on what I probably could have been, but that's okay. Things happen at the right time. So this one helps me understand different uses of grammar in different contexts, and it's one that I probably continue to use ongoing. It may be of interest to you. It's just the one I found. There's probably better ones out there, but I think if you're passionate about writing and looking to improve in that area, getting the grammar right is good. As you might see if you follow Twitter, presidents of certain parts of the world don't seem to know their grammar that well either. maybe they could pick it up for Christmas, or you could send it to somebody for a New Year's present that you think could write that a little bit better and a little bit more punctual or structured, perhaps. Book number 8 is called The Fifth Discipline, The Art and Practice of the Learning Organization by Peter M. Singh. And this one I think was originally published around 1990 and obviously have had numerous updates. I think the one I'm looking at here had an extra 100 pages, sometime published probably in the last 5 or 6 years. And as it says, it's all about organizations and how they can grow and develop based on 5 core components. Singh had said he believes that the 5 component technologies that are apparent, that he goes into detail on, are converging to innovate learning organizations. The 5 components are systems thinking, personal mastery, mental models, building a shared vision, and team learning. And it's really how all of these components work together to create a system and help an organization thrive or grow. I think one of the things people might get caught up on is when you think of a system, you might think of a computer system and the complexity therein. When Singh gives examples, he talks about maybe just breaking it down more to a personal level, and think of your family as a system and how that interacts, how complex that can be, how many people are working together to solve problems and create solutions in that kind of system environment. I remember I was reading this, I think I was in India at one point during this book, and I was getting a taxi to and from the office, and the craziness of the traffic was scary, but it worked, and I was wondering what the hell was it that was making that work. And that's kind of this organized chaos, and I think at the time I was reading a chapter from the book, and it just made sense in that there's a system there of traffic in what would appear to be very chaotic constructs, but it still works. And there's similar examples like that throughout the book. As Singh just says towards the end of chapter 1, this book is for learners, especially those of us interested in the art and practice of collective learning. For managers, this book should help in identifying the specific practices, skills, and disciplines that can make building learning organizations less of an occult art. For parents, this book should help in letting our children be our teachers as well as we are theirs, for they have as much to teach us about learning a new way of life as we do them. And for citizens, the dialogue about why contemporary organizations are not especially good learners and about what is required to build learning organizations reveals some of the tools needed by communities and societies if they're to become more adept learners. I know when I read it, I was blown away by some of the examples, some of the detail. It seems to have stood the test of time over the last 25 years. I suppose when this was written first, it was pre-internet, but it is still one that I hear recommended and referenced a lot. And it was one I really enjoyed, so I said I'd put it into the list. All right, we're nearly there, just 2 to go, and hopefully you're enjoying it. Hopefully you're writing down some notes, and maybe you might read some of these in 2019. So number 9 is one that was recommended on the podcast probably 2 or 3 times over the 2 years or so, and I eventually got around to purchasing and reading it this year. It had been on my radar for a while. It is called The Art of Happiness, The Art of Happiness, a Handbook for Living, is from the Holiness, or His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, and Howard C. Cutler, who pretty much wrote the book. So if you're familiar with the Dalai Lama, if you know about his story, if you know about what he stands for, you'll have a good understanding of what this book is about. If not, it's one that I would absolutely recommend you get into and read. Happiness is the ultimate, I think, from the perspective of the Dalai Lama. Everything that you can do can lead you towards happiness in his eyes. And he goes into lots of detail in the book on how we have a right to happiness, how we can tap into gaining that happiness, training the mind for happiness. So meditation and mindfulness and practices to be more in the moment, to be less striving, to be more present, definitely come up during this. And for me, that has been the game changer over the last few years. Don't get me wrong, still have crap and tough and horrible days, but more infrequent. And I put a lot of that down to just being a bit more aware of what you're thinking and feeling, and most of the time knowing that it's crazy and a lot of it isn't real and won't have any ultimate consequences because it won't happen. I think this book touches on a lot of that. The piece I just wanted to touch on that has been very stand out for me in the chapter called Overcoming Obstacles, Dealing with Anxiety and Building Self-Esteem, the Dalai Lama is asked how does he get anxious, does he get stressed, and how does he deal with it. And he has a few different examples of how he manages to keep that in check, and like everybody, he does experience it. Even he does. For somebody who could spend hours and days just being, it still comes up for him. And the interesting one that I picked out was when he was asked about it and how he deals with presenting in front of thousands of people sometimes, and knowing that they're all there for the same reason, to try and get some sort of enlightenment or guidance. The question put to him was, so how do you personally deal with that kind of anxiety? So here's where it starts. I think that even these days, just before a public talk or teachings are about to start, I always feel a little bit of anxiety. So some of my attendants usually say, if that's the case, then why do you accept the invitation and give teachings in the first place? He laughed again. So how do you personally deal with that kind of anxiety? I asked. With a querulous and unaffected tone in his voice, he said quietly, I don't know. He paused, and we sat in silence for a long time, as once again he seemed to carefully consider and reflect. At last, he said, I think having proper motivation and honesty are the keys to overcoming these kinds of fears and anxiety. So, if I am anxious about giving a talk, I'll remind myself that the main aim of giving this lecture is to be of at least some benefit to the people, not of showing off my knowledge. So, those points which I know, I'll explain. Those points which I do not properly understand, then it doesn't matter. I just say, for me, this is difficult. There's no reason to hide or pretend. From that standpoint, with that motivation, I don't have to worry about appearing foolish or care about what others think of me. So, I found that sincere motivation acts as an antidote to fear and anxiety. And that's something I've personally used when I've been presenting and doing talks and even doing this. If I feel that one or two people get something from it, that makes me feel much more comfortable. Knowing that that smaller audience might take something from it helps, rather than expecting that's going to change everybody's lives, and that just builds up too much anxiety and hope and can be deflating if it doesn't have the desired request, or the desired effect even. So yeah, that's the Art of Happiness, number 9. Definitely worth checking out, having on your bookshelf, and certainly helped me this year. Okay, finally, number 10 is a book that I'm currently reading, nearly finished. I'm kind of reading a couple of books in parallel, and just again, these are not in any order from good to bad or best to least best. They're just in the order I think that I probably have read them in more than anything. And this one is called Emotional Agility: Get Unstuck, Embrace Change, and Thrive in Work and Life. And it's written by Susan David, PhD. I had the absolute pleasure of meeting Susan in person when she was in Cork in November. She did a master class at the opening of the new IMI building in the Quays in Cork. And yeah, it was a real rare treat, a real great opportunity to meet somebody of Susan's stature and knowledge in the area of emotional intelligence, the area that I'm probably most passionate about in the last few years. And I managed to chat to her very briefly on her break, and I was probably coming across as a bit of a fanboy, I think is the term, but I didn't really care because it was cool to meet her in person. And it was a book I was aware of, and certainly one that I had on the long list, but thankfully I got to meet her and got a copy and have been enjoying it ever since. So what is emotional agility? Let me just give you a quote or a piece from the book. Emotional agility is a process that allows you to be in the moment, changing or maintaining your behaviours to live in ways that align with your intentions and values. This process, or their process, isn't about ignoring difficult emotions and thoughts. It's about holding those emotions and thoughts loosely, facing them courageously and compassionately, and then moving past them to make big things happen in your life. There's 4 main movements that you would put under the umbrella of emotional agility. Showing up is one, stepping out, walking your why, and moving on. And in the book, Susan goes into detail on each of those. And as I said, so far, I've really been enjoying the read. One standout quote from the presentation that Susan gave was when she talks about mindfulness. And again, going back to that definition there, being present in the moment is all about being mindful, being aware of what's going on right now and not catching it, not allowing that feeling or thought carry you off to a negative place, because a lot of the time it does, but realistically it's not real. But Susan mentioned this whole movement around mindfulness, and she said something funny that stuck with me, to say the buzz of mindfulness has been growing over the last few years, and people who are already crazy busy now have to do mindfulness. Now they have to take this extra thing on that was only going to add to their day and make them even more stressed, which I can see. I can definitely see people thinking, oh, this is the solution, but how am I going to fit that in potentially to my already crazy day? And it's not about that. It's something you can factor in, but it's not to be looked upon as this extra thing you can do. And as many proverbs or sayings go, the more you practice mindfulness, the more kind of time and return on investment you get from it. So that was Emotional Agility. Susan David, brilliant read so far. Another #1 Wall Street Journal bestseller, and certainly in the area of emotional intelligence, I think it's a great read. So guys and girls, that is the 10 books that I read this year that I put on a list and wanted to share a little bit more about them and see if it's something that, or if some of them are ones that you'd like to check out as well. As I look back on it, the themes that seem to emerge is organizational change, personal change and growth, emotional intelligence, maybe as a foundation to a lot of it. Knowing yourself well will allow you to change, to grow, to help others around you grow and develop. Using meditation and mindfulness as a tool there to allow you to make that change, not to be overwhelmed. There's certainly a creative element to some of those books to inspire you to take on that extra challenge or that new project that you'd like to dip into. For me it was writing, but it's podcasting, it's whatever, it's video, and there's kind of touching on physical, mental, emotional and even spiritual well-being weaving in through a lot of those books, and I guess that gives a good sense of where I'm at and what I'm interested in currently. Maybe it's an exercise of just looking back at the books you've read yourself this year, seeing is there a pattern across them, is there a topic or a theme jumping out. I do often get teased to say, have I ever read a fiction book? Would I ever consider not reading a self-help or personal development book? I read autobiographies, obviously there's some there. Yeah, I think it's whatever you enjoy, whatever gets your juices flowing and gets you alive and makes you feel awake. And that's, for me, the books that I mentioned there. I get a good buzz out of reading them, learning something, taking notes, and hopefully putting some of that into practice, because ultimately, take action to put your practice down, get that change moving. It takes discipline, and you need your focus and practice to help you get there. So some didn't make the cut. I was reading Sapiens for the last few weeks, and that's an amazing book, but probably on most people's lists already. I have started another book called Mindful Walking with Hugh O'Donovan. I'm going to be interviewing him in the new year, so that's probably one that'll be on the list next year. But reading's great. This year, I suppose, last year I did a lot of audible listening to books and found that good, but there's no substitute for physically just getting a book and reading it, I think, anyway. So look, hopefully that went down well. I've never done one of these before. Love to hear your feedback. Anyone stand out? Anyone that you think should be on my list for the coming year that I could read? And yeah, hopefully it's a 1% better podcast around books that has been of value to you. Not sure what date this is coming out yet, but whenever you listen to it, I hope you're in a good place. I hope you enjoyed it, and best of luck to you and yours in 2019. Thanks so much, and good luck.